Boldwood presents The Family Home, written by L H Stacey and read by Claire Story. Prologue, December 2014. With the sound of her husband's screams, yells and misguided prayers spinning around her mind, Imogen Gilby frantically gripped at the kitchen floor. Her blood-covered fingernails slid uncontrollably across polished ceramic tiles until, after what felt like an eternity, she reached the open doorway and launched herself through it, into the cold night air. With an overwhelming sense of fear and guilt, Imogen gave a terrified look over her shoulder. Right now, right at this moment, her husband Gerald could be taking his last breath. But she couldn't help him, not anymore. All she could do was save herself, and, with a deep intake of breath, she found a surge of energy and, anxiously, she pulled herself through the darkness and into a frozen and unforgiving terrain, where the ground was sharp and painful. It attacked her body in a way that felt like she was being stabbed by 1,000 tiny shards of glass that were penetrating her skin, and she wished for nothing more than to slow down, to stop moving, and to scream for help, but couldn't. Desperately, Imogen searched for a weapon, and, with hands that were already torn and painful, she pushed them under the bushes, in the hope that a garden tool had been thrown there, abandoned amongst the undergrowth, where only the nettles, ivy, and bindweed now thrived. As her breathing accelerated, she took another hurried glance over her shoulder, and, with a renewed determination to survive, she dragged her body along the ground and as close to the garden wall as she could get. Staying in the shadows was the only way she knew how to survive, and even though her beautiful clothes, hair, and body were now covered in both dirt and blood, she felt grateful for the darkness that enveloped her and gave her protection. With her eyes closed for just a beat, she listened. The sounds that had been coming from inside the house had now stopped. The air was uncannily still, and, with her breaths coming in short and sporadic gasps, Imogen listened for any indication that she was not alone, that her attacker had followed, and she prayed for the sound of sirens, for someone to arrive and help her. Instead, the only thing she could hear were the tiny and occasionally scurrying feet of the nocturnal animals that lived in the garden. And for a moment, with her breath held tight, she lifted her face out of the dirt and looked for the mice and the rats, and quickly she realized that, like everything and everyone else, even they had deserted her. Blinking back tears, Imogen stifled a sob. Her whole body shuffled, inch by inch, caterpillar style, along the edge of the wall, only stopping long enough to press a hand to her side where she felt the sticky warmth of blood seeping through her jumper. It coated her fingers and caused the pain to surge through her in waves, making her grit her teeth and wish she could scream. But to scream would attract attention, and, with her head tipped painfully to one side, she fixed her eyes on the wishing well that stood at the bottom of the garden. Behind it stood the church, right next to a long row of terraced houses. Each of the houses was shrouded in darkness, and Imogen desperately looked for the faintest flicker of light, anything to show her that just one person in just one of those houses could be peering through a window, and that maybe, just maybe, they might see her and get some help. She swallowed and wrapped her arms tightly around her body, and even though she could barely put up with the pain, she gave herself a hug. It was all she could think to do, in an attempt to stop the relentless shaking that was overtaking her body, and from somewhere deep inside her she let out a long, sorrowful, animalistic scream that pierced the night air. Even though by doing so she knew there was a chance she'd give herself away. The air was still, the temperature plummeting, and with her temper suddenly flaring up inside, Imogen let go of her body and began to roll her fingers in and out of tight, contorted fists. She knew that if she was found, she'd have to prepare for a battle. Only she knew she could never win. It was a thought that caused her to panic, and she clutched at the cold, frozen mud, and, with all the effort she had left in her body, she propelled herself forward. She knew how close to death she most probably was. The thought of curling up and giving in crossed her mind as a stream of hot, scalding tears clouded her vision. Biting down on her lip, she stared up at the sky where dark, looming clouds were circling above her. For just a few minutes she lay down in the dirt, in the darkness, and waited for the end to take her, but something deep inside her fought back, and she refocused on the church and the graveyard beside it. Her only hope was to get to the sanctuary of the church, to the safety it might just provide, and once more she tried to push herself upright, and pressed her back firmly against the wall as icy puffs of air expelled themselves from her mouth, and she battled with the pain. Short, sharp breaths were quickly followed by another long, gut-wrenching sob. She could feel herself drifting in and out of the darkness. It was a feeling she tried to shake off, but her body no longer had a desire to live. Too much had happened. Too many wrongs she could no longer put right. A life that had been lived in the shadow of others. She'd never thought about dying before, and right now she was sure that dying would be a blessing. It would give her the perfect escape, a way of running from a world that had been nothing more than a lie. And even though by dying she would finally rid herself of the guilt she'd carried for so many years, she couldn't help but feel a sense of panic whirling around her. It was like a giant python curling around her thoughts, and she began to think of all the people she'd let down. Their faces flashed before her with accusing eyes that tortured her soul, and she thought about the lies she'd told and the secrets she'd kept. But as she did, her breathing faltered, and she could feel the imaginary snake constricting her throat and her lungs with a pressure that stole her breath and threatened to choke her. In a last desperate attempt to save her own life, Imogen frantically threw her arm out in front of her, and as though her prayers had been answered, her fingers suddenly caught against something sharp, jagged and heavy. It was the weapon she'd hoped she might find, and with a frenzied grappling, she wrapped her bloodied fingers around it and dragged it towards her. "Thank you," Imogen mouthed the words, and realized that she now had a way of protecting herself and a reason to live. For a moment, she took pleasure in the tiny drops of rain that had begun to land on her face, her lips, and eyelids. It was a reminder of something real and good, and she inched forward in a final attempt to reach the safety of the church. But the pleasure was short-lived. From behind her, she heard the footsteps. They were heading straight towards her, and with the tool gripped tightly in her hand, she dragged her body behind the wishing well, where a painful, twisted half-smile crossed her face. She looked at the well that held so many of her secrets, and realized that the time had come for her to make one final, desperate wish. Chapter 1. Present Day, December 2023. Hattie. With the early afternoon sun resting on the surgery window, Hattie Gilby closed her eyes, and for what felt like the first time in days, enjoyed the small amount of warmth that landed on her face, which for the middle of December was both rare and deceptive. It was the first time in a week that the sun had broken through the dark, ominous rain clouds, which, along with an Arctic breeze, had made the temperatures drop. Her whole body had frozen each and every time a cold blast of winter air had blown through the surgery doors, that sprung open automatically every time a patient walked near them. With her head resting against her hand and her body slouching in her chair, Hattie stared at the computer and groaned as another file dropped into her inbox, and even though it was almost time for her to leave for the day, the referral letter would need to be sent. Just my luck, she growled under her breath. There's been nothing to do for the last hour, and now... She sighed with annoyance, but knew that it was just a typical day at the surgery. In the space of an hour, her work could easily go from frantic to mind-numbingly boring. Everything that happened depended on what patients walked in through the door, what their ailments were, and ultimately what kind of aftercare they needed. "Sorry, but I've gone and done it all wrong." An elderly gentleman's voice broke into her thoughts, and Hattie looked up as he approached the desk and removed his cap. "I didn't know what I was doing, and I think I pressed the wrong button." He leaned against the counter and ran a frail hand anxiously across the liver spots that covered his scalp. "Stupid machine, it wanted my date of birth, and I hit the wrong number, and now it doesn't know who I am." He paused, and with the cap being twisted around anxiously in his hands, began to pace across the tiled floor between the desk and the screen. "Not sure I know who I am myself most days," he muttered. "Only I have to see the nurse at 2:30, and..." He looked up at the clock. "And it's about that time now, so you couldn't be a love and give me a hand, could you?" He looked hopefully from Hattie to her colleague Emma, who sat beside her dressed in a pair of royal blue medical scrubs. To anyone walking past, it was clear that Emma wasn't a receptionist, that it wasn't her job to answer the phone or to help on the desk. But sitting at reception and hiding from the practice manager was her go-to place between patients, and Hattie couldn't remember a single day in the past 2 years that Emma hadn't sat there chatting endlessly about her love life or the sex she was or wasn't getting. And even though it was down to Hattie to answer the telephone and to see to all the patients who couldn't operate the check-in machine, it seemed that, much to the detriment of her own work, it was also down to her to listen to everything Emma had to tell her. Turning her chair towards Emma, she glanced hopefully in a fruitless attempt to get her help, but Emma had suddenly become engrossed in the computer screen that sat on the desk before her, and with an exaggerated flounce, she simply tossed her long blonde hair over her slim, hunched-up shoulders and twisted the chair in the opposite direction. Hattie glanced up and into the eyes of the elderly man, who was now leaning over her counter and giving her an anxious but hopeful gaze. "It's Mr. Marsh, isn't it?" Hattie asked politely as she made her way to him. "Now then, let me see what you've gone and done, and then we can put it right for you, can't we?" She clicked on the screen, pressed it to reset, and stood poised, ready to help him with the detail. "Go on then, your date of birth?" She leaned to one side and shoulder-bumped him gently. "You can tell me, I promise I'm not going to tell anyone." Appreciative that Hattie was willing to help, Mr. Marsh held a hand up to cup his mouth and surreptitiously whispered his details. "1st of May 1943, he revealed. "I'm 80 years young, you know. And if I reach 100, do you know what I'm going to do?" He raised his eyebrow and nodded. "I'm going to shout it from the rooftops, I am. That's provided I'm fit enough to climb a ladder." He pointed upwards and gave a mischievous smile that made Hattie forget her annoyance, and she smiled right back. "Oh, Mr. Marsh, something tells me you'll be more than capable," she replied with a laugh and pointed to the waiting room. "Now, if you want to take a seat in there, I'll let the nurse know you're here. I think her last patient went in just a couple of minutes ago, so she shouldn't be long." Sighing, Hattie returned to her desk and gave Emma a disparaging look. "If you're going to sit there and stop me working, the least you can do is help. I've got another referral letter to do before I can finish, so the next one over 40 is yours," she whispered, keeping her eyes on the screen, and began to tap heavily on the keyboard in front of her. "I swear this place has a distinct lack of decent-looking 20-somethings. Either that, or it's only the people over 40 who ever get sick." "Hey, hands off, the young ones are mine, you know that," Emma threw back. "Besides, what would you want with a 20-something male? You've got Charlie, haven't you?" Hattie's reaction to Charlie's name must have showed on her face, because Emma leaned in as close as she could and looked at her intently. "Hey, what happened? I thought the two of you were tight." She held her hands up in the air with her little fingers hooked tightly together. "Yeah, I thought we were too." Hattie continued to stare at her screen, but she felt the tears well up in her eyes. Talking about herself was something she rarely did. To speak about herself would bring up all sorts of memories she'd rather not talk about, and with her eyes pressed carefully together, she considered all the ways she could get out of being questioned about Charlie. "You can't stop there," Emma said. "I tell you all about my love life and the lack of it, so it's only fair that you tell me what happened. Did you meet someone else?" "Why on earth would you even think that?" Hattie snapped. "If you must know." She paused and sighed. She wasn't sure how to tell the story. For the past couple of years, Charlie had been her world, and now, well, now he wasn't. But Hattie could hardly tell Emma the truth. She could hardly say that Charlie had left because of something she'd done so many years before. Nor could she say that even though he'd known all about her family, who they were and what had happened to them, he'd never really known about the life they used to lead. "We had an argument, that's all. Charlie moved out." Satisfied with her version of events, Hattie opened the file that had dropped into her inbox and leaned across to pick up her headphones. "Oh, no, you don't." Emma's hand dropped on top of hers. "No one just has an argument and then, that's it. There's always more to the story." She opened her eyes wide, raised her eyebrows and stared. "I mean, are you okay? What about the bills? If he moved out, are you living on your own? Can you manage, or did you move the next one in?" She rolled her eyes upwards. "They don't exactly pay us a fortune here, so no one would blame you if that's what you did. And, of course, you have to be able to afford the necessities, like wine on a Friday." Hattie knew that her lifestyle and Emma's were completely different. However, she couldn't help but smile at her simplistic naivety of life, where all that mattered was getting home on a Friday and having a party until she woke up and realized that it was Monday. "Emma, there's nothing more to say. We argued and Charlie moved out." She swallowed away the sob that threatened to expose itself and thought about Charlie and how, as if by magic, he was now in Switzerland, with the lads who had all miraculously managed to take a holiday from work, all at the same time, exactly one day after he'd left the flat, which had all seemed just a little too coincidental for Hattie's liking. Sitting back in her chair, Hattie closed her eyes. It was a story she didn't want to tell, nor did she want everyone in the building to know her business. "Oh, my God. Did he leave you for someone else? Another woman, maybe? Or, Jesus, Hattie, don't tell me he moved in with a man?" Ignoring Emma's questions, Hattie flicked through the paperwork that covered her desk. She really didn't want to talk. What she really wanted was to finish the letter and leave for home. "Hattie? Emma? Forget it. There's nothing more to say. Charlie was a dick. He moved out. It's over, that's it." She turned, glancing up at the clock and willing the seconds to turn into minutes. "But aren't you scared living all by yourself? After what happened to your parents." It was a comment that made Hattie stop and stare. She had no idea that her work colleagues knew about her past, but clearly word had been passed around, and whether she liked it or not, she'd probably been the topic of everyone's conversation since she'd begun working there. "You know all about that." It was all she managed to say, as she watched the way Emma lifted her handbag out of the drawer, took out a small mirror, and admired herself in it. A gold lipstick was carefully chosen from a small pouch, and with the precision of a surgeon, she applied the soft pink shimmer to her lips. "Of course we know. You don't think you can keep secrets like that one, do you? Emma puckered her lips and rubbed them together. "Now, if you need someone to come and stay with you," she said, "all you have to do is call me. I could come over for a few days, maybe for the weekend. We could have a girly night," she gasped, "with pizza and everything, and you could finally tell me all about it." Feeling her whole body deflate at the thought, Hattie looked up from her computer and stared at the door. She could feel her cheeks burning with embarrassment, and with her mind spinning, she thought of all the times Emma had tried chatting to her, questioning her, digging for information about her life. Hattie thought of all the ways she'd avoided answering her questions or those of anyone else who worked at the surgery, and if she was completely honest with herself, she'd made it her mission to avoid making any of them friends, because friends ended up chatting and exchanging life stories. They would begin with conversations about what they were cooking for tea, and would quickly turn the chatter into a comparison of the happiest and worst days of their lives, and the last thing Hattie wanted to talk about was her life, and the night that had changed everything. She'd always kept the details to herself. About the night she'd found her father's stabbed, slaughtered body in the kitchen of their family home, or the way her mother had been brutally attacked and had almost died. Both stories were conversation stoppers, and even though people often wanted to hear the gory details, they just didn't know what to say or how to react. To be honest, Emma, and don't take this the wrong way, but I like being alone. The peace and quiet is something I look forward to, especially after sitting here all day being interrogated. Her words were full of resentment, and she said them in a voice that even to Hattie was a little louder than she'd have liked. "My plans for tonight include nothing more than a boiling hot bubble bath and a proper romance book where all the world is good, because then I don't have to answer any questions." She knew that she sounded like a petulant child, but she didn't care. And through narrowed, angry eyes, she glanced down at the drawer, dragged it open, and lifted her bag out and onto her knee. It was all she could do to avoid Emma's fierce-looking frown, and for something to do she began to rummage in her bag and surreptitiously glanced down at her mobile phone to see a whole list of missed calls and messages displayed on the screen, a sight that brought a sense of panic to her mind. Calls from Adam, her brother, and from her older cousin, Louisa, wouldn't normally be shocking, not in themselves, but an accumulation of more than a dozen missed calls, along with numbers she didn't recognize, could only mean that there was something wrong. Jumping up, she began to pace back and forth, and mentally she began preparing herself for what was to come. The thoughts and scenarios flashed through her mind. She could see her brother Luke, her mother, and once again she could see her father, lying there in a pool of bright red blood. They were all thoughts she didn't want, images she didn't want to relive, and with her phone still held tightly in her hand, Hattie grabbed her coat and raced for the exit. Chapter 2. Present day, December 2023. Hattie. "Okay, Louisa, take a breath." Walking at speed as she spoke, Hattie tried to dodge the rain, as well as the people who were walking towards her, and listened intently to what her older cousin was saying. "Tell me exactly what happened." "I went to see your mum," Louisa said. "I always go on a Friday. Grant works most days, but Fridays are the busiest, apparently, for cremating people, and the kids go to football. Visiting your mum gives me a couple of hours without them, and I enjoy those few hours where they're not screaming at me for whatever it is they want or need next." She sighed and paused dramatically, as the sound of the children could be heard arguing in the background, like now, when one wants fish fingers for tea, the other wants sausages, and yes, you guessed it, Kitty doesn't like either. So she's mooching around the kitchen looking for what else she could have instead. "So, Grant still works at the creme?" Hattie shuddered at the thought of burning those you loved. and she could still clearly remember the words her father had once used. You only burn rubbish, and people are not rubbish, which is why we bury them respectfully. Yeah, he's still there. It's a job, Hattie. There's not many of them around these days, and it suits him. He always gets the weekend off, which is great for us as a family, Louisa said defensively. You don't like Grant, do you? Louisa, sorry, I diverted, and yes, of course I like Grant, but you called me about Mum. Hattie moved to stand under a shop awning, pretending to look through the window at the freshly baked bread. And by the look of my phone, you called repeatedly. Was it important? She isn't well, Louisa finally said. They readmitted her to the hospital earlier in the week. Closing her eyes for a beat, Hattie waited for Louisa to continue. The phone went silent for so long that Hattie held it away from her ear and stared at the handset. She got used to the idea that her mother was ill and that, since the attack, she'd been constantly in and out of hospital, and that her prognosis had never really improved. Intensive care had been followed by critical care. Then there had been the months of rehabilitation, followed by the years of physiotherapy. Every course of treatment had been followed by different operations, none of which had improved her health, and Hattie had lost count of the multiple hospital wards she'd visited. Louisa, it's bad this time, isn't it? Hattie asked with a sob that was followed by a deep inward breath. The silence at the other end of the phone line had become too much. It was more than obvious that her cousin didn't want to tell her the news, and Hattie turned away from the shop window to turn her eyes up to the sky. The winter sun had disappeared, and the rain had taken its place again. For the first time since she began to walk to work rather than driving, she regretted the decision. Louisa, please tell me what's happened. Pressing the phone tightly to her ear, Hattie tried to swallow. Her throat had gone dry and her legs felt as though they were about to fail her. I can't lie, Hattie, she isn't good. She's had some tests and the results came back this morning. A sob left Louisa's throat, and Hattie could imagine her, sat in the corner of the cottage that had once been her parents'. Her brood of 3 children mooching around her ankles and a cat or two curled up on her knee. Louisa was only 3 years older than Hattie, although she always seemed much older, having to grow up quickly at the age of 16, when both of her parents had died in a car crash. And although Hattie's parents had tried to look after her, Louisa had quickly decided to go it alone and look after herself, which hadn't always turned out for the best. What test results? Hattie demanded. No one told me she was having any. Pressing the phone to her ear, she wished she'd waited to make the call. At least, if she'd been at home, she could have sat in silence instead of being surrounded by pedestrians and a shopkeeper who kept marching to his door with his hands on his hips, sighing and marching back in. Glancing around for somewhere better to stand, Hattie ran her gaze along the other shops and the 2 village pubs. Even though she'd lived here for the past 4 years, she'd rarely used the local amenities, preferring to do her shopping out of town where no one knew her. Hattie, we've all been trying to phone you, and there's no easy way of telling you this. She's got cancer. As though she hasn't been through enough. Now she's got bloody cancer, and it's just not fair, is it? Hattie leaned against the wall, as the air left her body, and it felt as though she could no longer breathe. Where is she? She finally managed to ask. Did you say she was back in the hospital? She's in Friarage, in their cancer treatment ward, but there's nothing they can do. They've said that we have 2 options, move her into a hospice, or she could go home, Louisa said. But whichever you choose, it needs to happen quite soon, and personally I'd go for the hospice. At least there they have professionals, people who are there the whole time, and, she wouldn't be alone. Hattie could hear the difficulty Louisa had in saying the words. Her voice had become little more than a whisper, her words slow. A hospice? Hattie asked. Isn't that where people go to die? As she uttered the words, she realised the stupidity of the statement and the enormity of the situation hit her. A hospice meant that her mother had weeks, possibly only days, left to live, and without hesitation she began to regret all the time she'd missed a visit. The excuses she'd made and all the things she still had to say but had no idea how to say them. Hattie. There was a pause between words. I know you haven't been back to the house. Not since, but it is time. I really think it's time you came home. There's things to do and there will be a lot to organise. Her voice was full of concern. She knew how much Hattie hated the thought of stepping back into that house, of how many memories would hit her the moment she did. I don't think I can, Hattie whispered as she heard a commotion in the background, and could sense that Louisa had placed her hand over the handset. Will you three stop it, or I swear to God I'll turn the bloody Wi-Fi off, and no one will get to play the game, she shouted out loud. Amid the sound of 3 young children groaning and moaning, Hattie's mind went back to the way she'd grown up with her 2 younger brothers. The fighting and commotion had been a normality of everyday life, as had the constant lectures, which would result in all of them being sent to their rooms for what felt like hours on end. At the time, she'd never have considered the idea that one day she wouldn't be at home, or that she'd ever move away. But now 9 years later, she knew that she'd have to go home and really didn't know how they would make her feel. Hattie, you have to come home sometime, Louisa said, as though reading her mind. I mean, if you really don't want to go back to the house, you could stay here, but I don't think you'd like it. You know how small my cottage is. The kids are always running riot. It's bedlam during the hours they're awake, and most days I feel unbelievably sorry for the neighbours. I can't, Lou. I have to stay here. She was going to say she had Charlie, but she suddenly realised that she didn't have him anymore. She was all alone. And now she knew that everyone at the surgery had been discussing her business. She didn't feel as though she'd ever be happy about going back there either. Do you know what, Lou? I don't have Charlie, she admitted, and maybe I should come back. Feeling suddenly emotional, she thought about the way she'd unintentionally distanced herself from her brothers, the phone calls between them that had become fewer and fewer, and selfishly Hattie thought about how she'd feel if she drove all that way and they didn't want to see her. But then, if they didn't want her to be there, why had Adam tried to call her? Hattie, there's something else you should know. You know how your mum hasn't spoken, not coherently, to anyone for the past 9 years? She asked. Well, lately she has. And she's been asking for you. It feels as though she's got something to say, Hattie, something that matters. Chapter 3. Present day, December 2023. Hattie. With her heart pounding heavily in her chest, Hattie stepped out of her car in Ugathwaite to stand in front of the vicarage, the house she used to call home. Standing on the pavement, she hovered beneath a single hazy streetlight that flickered with slow, intermittent flashes. It gave the road an eerie feeling, as white clouds of fog rolled in from the fields, and unconsciously she gripped her keys tight between her fingers, formed a fist, and allowed the keys to poke out aggressively between them. Staring intently, she could see that the house was shrouded in darkness. It was a clear indication that neither of her brothers were home, and, while still holding the keys in one hand, she pulled her phone from her pocket with the other and flicked at the screen as her phone began to vibrate. Adam, where are you? Closing her eyes for a moment, Hattie pushed away the internal anguish she'd felt about coming back. It was something she'd always known would happen, especially after leaving in the way she had, and even though she'd tried, she hadn't been able to convince either of her brothers to go with her. I'm at the hospital. Mum isn't doing too good, Her breathing is quite laboured, and to be honest, sis, I don't want to leave her." As Adam whispered the words, he opened and closed a door, and Hattie heard the door click to a close behind him. It was a moment that made Hattie take a deep inward breath, bite down on her lip, and begin to quiver with an emotion she had been continually suppressing for the past 9 years. "Give me a min. I'll come to you. Which ward am I aiming for?" "No, please don't do that. That's why I called." Pausing, Adam took a breath, and Hattie could hear the sound of his footsteps clicking along the hard tiled floors of the hospital corridor. "I'm looking outside right now, and the fog, Hattie, it's pea soup round here. Even I wouldn't drive in it, and to be honest, I think you'd be better off sitting it out and waiting till morning." "But—" Taking a breath, Hattie leaned against the dry stone wall and looked up to stare at the house more closely. The ivy that had grown up the walls had already taken over the bricks and some of the windows. It looked as though it had been continuously growing upward, and now it appeared to be on a mission to swallow the gutters and the downpipes whole. "But I'd rather be there," she said unequivocally. She looked between the house and the car, took a slow breath in, and could feel the rhythm of her heart accelerate. Being here alone, waiting for Luke, hadn't been part of the plan, and immediately she rolled the keys in her hand and took a step back towards where she'd parked. It was a conscious decision to park the car on the side of the road rather than pulling into the driveway, but now she wondered why she'd done it. Had she intended making a fast exit, making sure she wasn't trapped in the drive behind other vehicles, or was it that getting out of the car and opening the gates would have been far too decisive? "Seriously, Luke won't be long, and yes, before you ask, he's still as grumpy as hell, but you two need to talk. You need to sort things out once and for all." "Adam, I could be with you in less than 20 minutes. I'm sure the weather isn't so bad that I wouldn't get there. I mean—" She turned, stared at the fields where the fog rolled slowly towards her. "I just came over the valley. It can't be that bad already, can it?" "Hattie, just wait for the weather to alter. You know what it's like up here. It can change in minutes, and there's enough for you to face here tomorrow, without lining yourself up for it tonight. Besides, Mum's asked that we all come together. She wants us all to be here at the same time, and she's saying that she's got something to tell us, and it sounds important, Hattie." The sound of a car passing by and slowing down made Hattie look nervously around her, and, with her eyes fixed on the tail lights, she held her breath until the car disappeared around the corner. "Adam, don't you think it's odd that she didn't speak to us for years, and now she can?" It was a question that fell from her lips as she thought back over the years, to the hours she'd sat beside her mother's bed, chatting away, talking about everything and nothing. She'd always been under the impression that her mother couldn't speak, when, in reality, it had been that she simply hadn't wanted to. I find it all a bit strange, don't you? I mean, why would she do that? She isn't chatting, Hattie. The words are not fluent, not like they were, and she struggles to put full sentences together. He paused reflectively. Maybe she was embarrassed and didn't want us to see her like that. Leaning against her car, Hattie could feel the moisture from its surface seeping into her jeans, and, with a sigh, she took a step forward to stand in front of the wall. The last thing she wanted was to be here, stood outside this house, alone, without Adam. He was the younger of her two brothers, the more grounded and dependable, who'd at least made some effort to keep in touch with her, and right now, the thought of him not coming back was overwhelming. She felt a stifled sob leave her throat. "Hey, come on, don't get upset." She must have had her reasons, and right now none of us know what those reasons are. I just hope that tomorrow gives us some answers, and that it isn't the truth I always feared. As he spoke, his voice broke too, and Hattie's heart plummeted at the thought that Adam was at the hospital, coping with their mother alone. "And what is it you think she'll tell us?" Her mind flew back to a day when she'd found him searching their mother's office, with fury in his eyes. It had been a day when he'd become obsessed with a note that had been written, a passing comment their mother had made. "I know what you thought back then, what you suspected. But just because Louisa was adopted, it doesn't mean that we were," she added. "And it wasn't a secret. Her parents actually told her about it as soon as she hit 16. I can still remember how shocked our mum had been, and I'm sure that if there had been something to say, they'd have said it back then. Don't you think?" A loud bang made Hattie spin on the spot, and, with eyes that were wide and filled with angst, she searched the square that stood at the other side of the road. It was a large area where trucks used to park that, since she'd left, had been turned into a communal space for the community to enjoy. The concrete had been replaced with grass and park benches, and the borders had been filled with trees and bushes that, even though it was winter, still created at least 100 different places for someone to hide, especially now that the fog had begun to roll in and was quickly surrounding each of the trees as it went. "To stay here, there's a chair beside Mum's bed. The nurses gave me a blanket last night, so I'll get myself comfy, and at least then someone is with Mum." It was more than obvious that Hattie had missed something that Adam had said, and in her annoyance she stared at the handset. Okay, I'll stay here." It was all she could say. And after confirming the time that they'd all meet the following morning, Hattie ended the call. Contemplatively, Hattie ran her fingers along the dry stone wall until she reached a small wooden gate that was old and worn, and, like the rest of the house, in desperate need of some tender, loving care. The gate was covered in loose shards of paint, which she flicked away with cold, shaking fingertips, something she'd have never been allowed to do while her father had been alive. Back then there would have been no shards to pull. The gate would have been painted annually right before spring in a bright red colour to match the front door. Taking a step back, Hattie wavered before walking forward and quickly realised that she'd always thought about coming back but hadn't, and there had been days when she'd thought that she'd never come back at all. Yet here she was, and, with her chest constricting, she gave the gate a determined push and felt the resistance beneath her fingers as it gave out a loud, ominous, grating sound that filled the air, leaving Hattie in no doubt that the gate was broken and trapped against the tarmac. Standing to one side of the path, she peeped between the conifers to look at the house next door. By standing in one place, she could move her head from side to side and take in one small part of the garden at a time, and, hesitantly, she looked along the path to where a low wall divided the front of the garden from the back. It had been a wall she remembered their father building, a wall that was supposed to be much higher, but a miscounting of bricks had meant that it was low enough for them all to jump over. In front of it stood a Christmas tree she'd rescued from the side of the road as a tiny 12-inch sapling. It had been a bitterly cold day, but even so, she remembered she'd walked around for what had felt like an age, deciding where she should plant it, picking a place in the back garden close to the wishing well. But when her father had forbade it, she'd been made to plant it at the front of the house, next to the wall instead. It was a memory that caught her by surprise, and quickly she tried to conjure up one or two of her happier days. She needed reminders of the good times, the days when she'd had fun and had felt loved, in the days before her world had fallen apart. Glancing from one part of the garden to the other, she finally rested her gaze on the shed. It was the place where she'd shared her first kiss, and the old wooden swing chair that had long since fallen from its chains was where she'd sat, holding hands with her first love, who had felt, so important at the time. There was the patch of land where she'd always stood her bike, and the long, low concrete ledge that she'd often played on as a child. Unable to resist, Hattie pointed her toes, stretched out her arms, and, like a funambulist balancing on a long and dangerous tightrope, walked along its edge, In her childish imagination, the rope had always wobbled precariously, but today, and because of all the extra growth in the bushes, her wobble was real, and she struggled to stay upright until eventually she jumped off at the end and clapped her hands in delight like a child, awarding themselves for their own amazing performance. Hearing a noise, she once again peeped through the conifers to see the shape of a car pulling up on the drive next door. It was a house that had used to belong to old Mrs. Hickin, a peculiar woman who over the years had had one or two run-ins with Hattie's parents. She'd always had something to say, something to complain about, and Hattie wondered if there was a chance she still lived there. But the newly painted frontage, and the sight of a younger woman standing in the upstairs window rocking a baby back and forth in a slow but obviously well-practiced rhythm, told Hattie that it was highly unlikely. Giving the young woman an envious smile, Hattie realised that everything about the village, including the old neighbours, would have changed. But then, who could blame them? No one in their right minds would intentionally live in a house next door to theirs. Not by design and certainly not by choice. And it amazed her that anyone had chosen to live there now. Leaning back against one of the trees, Hattie went over her options. In an ideal world, Luke would have already arrived home. He'd be kind, welcoming, and would completely ignore the fact that she hadn't been back to the house for the past 9 years. Nothing would be said. But life wasn't that simple. With her fingers still holding on to the keys in her pocket, she wondered whether she should just let herself in. But the thought of meeting her brother was already causing her stomach to do somersaults, without him arriving home to find her snooping around in the house that he still lived in. Suddenly, she felt the weight of the world press down on her shoulders. It was the pressure that she'd felt before, and the guilt and doubt that had filled her mind. She'd felt exactly the same the last time she'd been here, and without warning her knees went weak. Her mind spun with a million apologies she knew she'd have to make, and then, without warning, the taste of acid hit the back of her throat. Her stomach retched, and every inch of her body began to shake with a trepidation she'd hoped would never come back. "It's different now. Everything's different. It wasn't your fault." She said the words over and over like a mantra. She swallowed nervously, wiped her mouth on the back of her hand. Then, like the blade of a knife cutting through her thoughts, she heard the church bells toll. It was a sound she should have expected, but one she hadn't wanted to hear, not after the last time, when she'd been staring into her father's dying eyes, with no choice but to kneel in the blood that surrounded his body, and she'd listened to the toll of the bells as his pulse diminished. It was a night she wanted nothing more than to forget, and, with her eyes pressed tightly together, she pushed her fingers firmly into her ears and prayed for the tolling to stop. Fixing her eyes firmly on the front door, Hattie deducted that, like the gate, it hadn't been painted for a number of years. Each of the brass door numbers were now only held on by a single screw, which left each of the numbers to hang untidily upside down, and she couldn't help but wonder what her father would say and how angry he'd be. For all the world to see, he'd been the kindest, gentlest man. But the reality had been that he'd ruled the house with his Bible, and, like the flickering of images at the beginning of a film, small nuggets of memory filled her mind, as one image after the other flashed right before her. After speaking to Louisa, she'd been sure that coming back to the house was the right thing to do, and, knowing that she owed it to her mother to be here, she'd packed a bag, phoned the surgery, and let them know she wasn't going back. It had been a call she'd dreaded, but once it was over, she'd been filled with an immense sense of relief. And even though the rent on her flat still needed to be paid, she knew that looking for another job would be right at the top of her list, just as soon as she'd been to visit her mother. With her fingers trembling with the cold, Hattie reached for the door and lay her hand against it. And then, I'm going to look for the truth, she said in a low but definite voice. Now that I'm back, and even if it kills me, I will get justice for what happened to my family. Chapter 4, Present Day, December 2023. Sophie. After hearing the gate scrape open next door, Sophie Alexander crept through her dimly lit house and into her son Noah's bedroom, and while using the curtains as a barrier to hide behind, she peered out through the window to look over the front of the house and onto the garden below. Shielding Noah with her hand, she smiled at the way he held onto her like a baby limpet, all arms, legs, and a mouth that was currently welded to a spot on her shoulder where he desperately tried to suckle her skin. "Come on, stop that," she whispered. "You've just had your supper, greedy guts, and you can't be hungry, can you?" She sang the words in her soft Irish accent and rocked him rhythmically from side to side as she glanced out of the window and stood on her tiptoes as she spotted a young woman who appeared to be creeping around in the garden next door. Tipping her head to one side, she watched the woman's movements suspiciously and tried to remember how long it had been since she'd noticed anyone on the garden path, other than Luke, Adam, or the team of carers that had turned up, morning, noon, and night, to look after Imogen. There had often been a constant stream of them, along with a series of parcel deliveries and fast food guys that had turned up on a regular basis. But no one else had been there for months, which was why she was now taking an unhealthy interest in the woman who was venturing around in next door's neglected garden, watching the fog roll towards her, like a length of voile being dragged across the fields, turning everything white as it went. Pulling the curtain to one side, Sophie smiled as the woman held her arms out to each side and began to walk slowly along a long, narrow ledge that bordered the garden before jumping off and clapping like a child. Her shoulder-length auburn hair bounced around her shoulders, and, just for a moment, a heart-warming smile crossed her face. But then, as though a switch had been flicked, she gave an anxious look over her shoulder and stared uneasily into the distance, as though she were fully expecting someone to appear out of the fog that surrounded her. "So, who are you then?" Sophie whispered over the top of Noah's head. "A friend? A girlfriend? What do you reckon, Noah?" Rocking her son from side to side, Sophie patted Noah's back and prayed that he'd go back to sleep. With a yawn, she thought of the last conversation she'd had with Luke. Just that morning they'd chatted as he'd left for work, which had been a vast improvement on when they'd first met, and he'd rushed past her with no wish to communicate at all. At least now he'd spend the time of day, yet she couldn't help but feel a little slighted that he hadn't mentioned the impending visitor, although that probably meant that Luke wasn't aware she'd be coming at all, and that maybe she was a friend or a girlfriend of Adam's. Moving to the chair beside the window, Sophie perched on its edge and continued to rock Noah back and forth. It was a good place to watch the world going past, and with Noah laying against her, busily sucking on his fist or rooting for milk, it was a good place for her to relax and to take a few moments. "Shh, there you go, Noah. Now then, why don't you take your nap like a good boy before your daddy turns up?" She paused and thought of Finn. "He'll be calling in to see you soon, so he will," she said softly. "In fact, why don't we both take a bit of a rest, just for a few minutes?" She allowed herself to lean back in the chair, where she closed her eyes and listened to the constant drone of traffic that went past outside. It was a noise she liked, a reminder that right outside her front door the world was still turning, and that even though she hadn't seen a soul for the whole day, they were still out there, still walking and driving right past. Her pajamas were covered in baby food, and, without a doubt, she needed a shower. She didn't really have time to sleep, and more than anything she had to get dressed before Finn arrived, and before he realised that for the second time that week she hadn't got dressed at all. There doesn't seem much point most days, Noah, does there? Nothing ever happens, and no one other than your daddy ever comes to visit. It was true. Her friendship group was all back in Ireland. Her life here a total contrast to the life she'd had before, where people dropped in and out of each other's houses on a daily basis. Coffee would have been made and gossip shared. Here, she fully expected that she and Finn would have been together, for them to bring Noah into the world and for the three of them to be a family. It was the dream she'd hoped for after meeting Finn at a medical convention in Durham. He'd courted her relentlessly, until he'd finally convinced her to move here from Dublin, which was something she initially hadn't thought about doing, but one too many visits to England had seen her pregnant with Noah, and even though her pregnancy had been a complete